I'd say it's been pretty like tectonic, pretty major shifts. And I think that's mainly come from the new, I'll say credibility, but just generally like power that journalists of color, particularly Black journalists, got after George Floyd's murder. A lot of newsrooms found themselves with their pants down when it came to how they were treating their journalists of color and how they were conducting themselves. And so I think a lot of journalists of color really got a lot of power and really got a lot of say in how they clean that up.
I think to the extent that standards are shifting, it's because of the media environment, that we have social media and a typical journalist has so many other faces that he or she is exposing to the public, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook or, whether they have a podcast or whatever. I mean, we're all kind of we're all publishers. We all have our own brand. You're able to just let things fly and no editor reads what you're going to tweet.
I think the younger generation is pushing back, especially because we grew up on social media. So it's kind of like interesting that these policies were created by people who, and this isn't to be ageist or anything, but like people who didn't grow up, with a MySpace or Tumblr or something like that, like kind of defining how we should engage online.
I think our industry is at a really difficult crossroads on this. Prior to very recent, it was largely impossible for an individual journalist or reporter to express much opinion or bias publicly. Today, every individual journalist and every individual person has publishing power. We're now publishers of our own news outlets. And I think that creates a different tension than has existed previously, because the printing press that is my Twitter feed is not owned by my employer. It's mine. The idea of policing public expression is about lying to readers. Journalists do have biases. They do have political opinions. These policies are purely about concealing that truth from the reader as to convince them of something that is not true, that the reporter does not have biases. The issue theoretically is not about the having of bias, it's about the public expression of it. What I would question is, one, what right an employer has to regulate the speech and expression of an individual when that person is off the clock. And two, what actual utility and purpose this serves in our industry. We exist in a hyperpolarized, hyperpartisan time where there has been a decades-long campaign by one political party to convince its followers not to believe anything they read in the media. And we believe that our science intern not being able to tweet how they feel about a city council race is the thing that is going to save us. That the photography intern not going to the Women's March is the way we're going to save our credibility with the populace. It's nonsensical. It's divorced from any reality.
The one that I can think of right now is something that happened actually earlier this year. And it was actually like the first time where I had, conversations with our masthead about neutrality, objectivity. I worked on a story about a billboard series that an artist painted kind of the moment that George Floyd died on these billboards. And they were put up around the country as just kind of like, it wasn't protest, it's just kind of like bringing awareness to what happened. And so in writing this story, I wrote, I think it was like in the first couple sentences, like the cruel death of George Floyd. Like this artist depicted the cruel death of George Floyd. And my direct editor didn't have a problem with it. And then like when it got to the copy desk, I learned that cruel got taken out because it wasn't, I don't remember the exact words, but it wasn't objective is what they were saying. It wasn't neutral. I think neutral was the word they used. It wasn't neutral. And I was like, wait, what? Like, I don't understand. I actually don't understand this at all, because last summer, the whole world, like, there were global uprisings around this death because it was objectively cruel. And we use cruel to describe like animal cruelty and that kind of thing. So why couldn't we use it here? And it became like a whole ordeal. The word was still taken out. Like I didn't, win this battle, but I had, the conversation got like elevated, and I had a conversation with like the masthead about it, just like a Zoom, being like, if this word isn't neutral, like what does neutral mean for the paper? I'm just really a little bit disturbed and confused that describing, a man with a knee on his neck for like 8.5 minutes, that's not cruel. Like, we can't say that. What implications does that have for everything else that I'm writing, even if it's less like, I don't know, less confrontational. So my questions weren't really answered. We had a meeting. They're like, oh, you brought up some great points. But I think I was just curious, like, but what is neutral of this paper? Is it from the perspective of like an older white man? Is that, what neutral is? And is that the stance the paper's taken? And that's kind of like caused me internally to like question these things a lot more.
The way I would word it is I think that mainstream media remains largely unintegrated. That standards, expectations, norms have all been set in a management environment that is almost exclusively white and overwhelmingly male. And because of that, because these things are subjective, and what we're talking about is where is the line between what is an opinion and what is a stateable fact, what needs to be couched and what does not, what is racist and what is racially tinged, or whatever that means. You can imagine that an industry by which the people making those decisions are almost exclusively white would draw those lines in places that are different than an industry where the decision makers were more diverse. I say this all the time. One of the big debates that was had towards the end of the Trump administration was which and what of his behaviors could be accurately deemed or called racist. And he, openly advocated for congresswomen of color who had been born here to, quote, go back where they came from. Well, by any honest or diligent study of history, it's clear and obvious that this was racist. And yet, much of the mainstream media refused to call these comments racist. It's very hard to believe that if you had a masthead of 10 Black people, they would have spent much time debating whether or not the clearly racist thing was racist. Instead, we don't have mastheads of 10 Black people. We have mastheads of 7 white people and like 3 others. And those 3 others have had to ascend in an environment in which they have to acquiesce the subjective feelings of this majority white industry. And so they may feel a desire to self-censor or have even had their perspectives changed and molded by the overwhelming whiteness of the industry. And so, again, I don't know necessarily that expectations are different. The way I would frame it is that I think that Black reporters and other reporters of any minority are placed in positions in which they are seen as oppositional to the norm. And too often in the industry, we don't understand that the norm is not itself an objective neutral. Rather, it's a subjective decision we've all made. Just because it's always been done this way does not mean it has to be done this way. Just because we all talk this way doesn't mean we have to talk this way. Just because you think this thing that is not the journalistic neutral, it's just a thing you think, it is your opinion. And I think that is something that many people in the industry have not really had to grapple with.
I personally believe that no one's unbiased. And I think like this idea that the journalist is this neutral, objective person with no biases. I think that's just like, that's kind of dumb. Like, we all have our own biases. And I think for people of color, that's kind of been used as something to use against them. Like, you can't say Black Lives Matter because it's too political. And it's like, as a Black person, like, what do you mean by that? There's questions about like, can journalists attend Pride? There's some people who are like, well, I'm gay or I'm a lesbian. Why couldn't I attend Pride? Like, that doesn't make sense. I don't think objectivity is real. And I think that it's been used as a way to frame whiteness, to say that, whiteness is neutral and that's the standard that we work around. And I think like people have been starting to push back against that for good reason.
The reality is to be a human is to be political. And I think that often these policies try to litigate minutia while ignoring this bigger and broader truth. The reality is we have to hire trustworthy people who are committed to rigorous work and hold them to high professional standards. And if we do all those things, it really doesn't matter what they tweeted on Tuesday night or where they marched on Saturday. The way I word it is that I think the values of journalism can conflict with the interests of journalistic organizations. It is in the best interest of a journalistic organization to be as widely read and trusted by as many people as possible. Except in any environment, much less in a hyper-polarized, hyper-partisan environment, simply telling the truth is an act that will turn off more than 50% of your audience. If you think about historically, a newspaper in the South that would have launched on a big investigation into whether or not Black people were being denied the right to vote would have concluded they were, would have been obligated to write that down, and I can imagine would have lost a lot of subscribers. It would not have been in the best interest of the Birmingham News to do a massive expose in 1963 about the access to vote to the ballot box for Black people and to tell the truth about what it found. And so I think that there is a balancing act there. I think we see this especially in politics, where it's in the best interest of a reporter, much less of a publication, to have Republicans be willing to return their phone calls, or Republicans to broadly, theoretically, if you could get them to trust the reporting. But at times, that may clash with the value of, well, but we have to tell the truth here about what just happened yesterday. And so I think that there's a clash between those two things on issues of race all the time. That you have majority white newsrooms led by majority white editors who are writing for an audience they imagine to be majority white. And we know that in our country, perspectives and perceptions of issues of race vary broadly and drastically based on the race of the respondent. And so a Black reporter writing for white editors and a white audience is often going to encounter pushback on things that they believe to be true, but that makes the white editor and by extension, the white audience uncomfortable.
It is our duty to support truth and to make sure that people have an opportunity to hear that truth. And I think that even though my magazine has its own biases, we are liberal. We are still supporting truth by telling these stories. These are still true stories that are allowing a larger perspective and a better understanding of events, a better understanding of people that maybe wouldn't be out there otherwise. But yes, how do we effectively refute the lies, especially when there are people in media who are promoting those lies? How do we do that piece without increasing factions? Because we are definitely in danger of becoming even more polarized, even though that sounds insane. It sounds like we couldn't possibly go further apart from one another than we are, but that is the danger.
We're in such a weird time where I don't know if people are really even engaging news a lot of times, or they're like, they have their one source and that's kind of all they read or engage with or watch or something like that. A lot of people talk to younger people and they don't read news at all. Like they kind of get it from Twitter or TikTok or Instagram. I do think journalism has to evolve and like meet people where they are. It's like a really tough environment right now. It's very polarized. And it's also like a tough industry because people, they're not reading, they're not paying for news. They don't think that they have to pay for news. And then journalists don't have jobs. And then when there's no jobs, there's not people reporting on what's happening in a community or a city. And there's a lot lost when you don't have that.
I think society needs a journalism industry that is unsparing in its commitment to the truth, to fairness, and to justice. We've had an industry that has been too scared to be accused of bias by malevolent, bad faith actors, that we've compromised the values that are supposed to be important to us, which are truth and fairness. And those values need to be reflected not only in our work, but in how we operate with as individuals and more importantly, as organizations. If I watch you fire an intern in a way that is unfair, how can I trust your journalism to be fair? If I watch you enforce social media policies in ways that are inequitable or seem unfair and arbitrary, how do I trust the language you're putting on the front page of the newspaper? The journalism is a field built on trust. And that trust can be broken in more ways than one.
I mean, there's the balance of the work that I want to pursue, but then the work that I am assigned to pursue. And there's like less and less journalists now because the industry is really struggling. So there's so much news. And you have to figure out what is the story that I can write. And like, I don't want to burn myself out working all the time. So that's, I think, the challenge is that there is just a lot of stuff out there, a lot of news, a lot of worthy news, but you can't cover all of it. You have to pick. And so then people might feel like, well, you're not talking about this issue or you're not writing about this thing. It's like, I like physically can't. Like I'm doing what I can, but it's hard, I think, for sure.
You know, our job is we're just sort of feeding the assembly line. You're on a treadmill, cranking out these stories, and you're just trying to fill the spaces. Beyond clicks, it's sort of like there often isn't very much thought like, how is this meeting the needs of the reader, and are they happy with this? And you know, the higher ups have focus groups and so forth. But it's hard for us to think too much, spend too much time thinking, how can we do this better? And how are we letting down the readers? Or how can we better serve the readers? It's how can we get an interesting story into the paper next Wednesday?
I think because these expectations go unstated, because most newsrooms do not explicitly state their values. Most newsroom leaders are actually uncomfortable having much full conversation explaining their values or expectations. That newsrooms are governed largely by unwritten rules, by internal customs, by local and newsroom traditions. And because of that, you end up having systems where different individuals are treated differently. And what crosses a line and what does not cross the line is up to the subjective judgment of subjective decision makers. That everyone knows where the line is, says three people who are the arbiters of where the line is, but that doesn't actually mean that everyone knows where the line is. What I think is true is that because that line is subjective, because that line moves around, because those expectations change and look different from newsroom to newsroom, it can be very difficult for folks to know exactly where and what the line is. And often, the people who are enforcing these decisions, the people who have the most power in the newsroom, which are middle managers, right? Not actually the figureheads, but the people who are doing the line editing every day. They often are just reading tea leaves based on what they think their theoretical bosses want, not even based on clearly and obviously stated standards and expectations. And so what you have are just layer upon layer of subjective decision making in which values and expectations and where a line is and where it isn't gets passed down, often without anyone involved in the chain being able to fully articulate why decisions are being made in one way and why they're not being made in a different way. Okay, I think the news organizations could be clear about what their policies and standards are, which I don't think is much to ask. And yet I think it's very obvious and very clear that's not the case. I think news organizations should state full-throatedly their values. I think they should explain their policies. I think they should trash policies that leave massive gray areas, which most of these as policies as written do. They should be vigilant not to have unequal enforcement. If I get in trouble for something, so should the person sitting next to me. I think that's at the very least. Whether I agree with their standard or not, if I know what the standard is, then I can abide by it or choose not to. I think many journalists aren't even being granted that ability. They couldn't follow the rules if they wanted to because the rules are so amorphous. And I think that that is an issue. I think a news organization that want to go above and beyond that could have conversations and actually listen to the people who work for them about where they think these lines should be, how they best express these values. Now, again, conversations require talking and listening. And if some of these organizations aren't willing even to define what their standards and policies are and explain them, it's very hard to imagine they're going to sit down and not only do that, but then listen to other people and their feelings about them. But I think that that's very important. Norm Pearlstein, the outgoing editor of the LA Times, gave a comment to the New York Times talking about the consent of the governed and how important the consent of the governed will be for the new generation of editors. The idea that no longer will the editor be an emperor, but rather they will have to be more of a democratic power than that people will not just do what you want them to do because you are the boss. And in fact, in this moment now, will not only not do the thing you want, but talk publicly about how you had this dumb thing you wanted us to do. And I think that that has created a crisis for a set of editors who came up in relatively tyrannical times, where they could and would do whatever they wanted to you, and you were just happy to be there and not laid off. I don't believe that's the case now, and I don't think that's how it's going to be in the future. I think people expect responsive leadership that actually listens to them, that hears them out, and is willing to admit when it's wrong. And I think that's a massive change from the last generation of newsroom leadership.
There was one colleague in particular who recently left to take a job elsewhere. And she's someone who I admire very much because not only was she like a change maker just internally, like pushing us to reevaluate and reconsider the way that we've been doing things for years and years, but she was also just a kind of big thinker. Part of the reason that she left and part of her frustrations was that she was promised one thing, like during the interview, where they told her that she would be given the freedom to explore and pursue some of these deeper, more ambitious enterprise pieces. But when it came down to it, the editors kind of like, there was this quiet expectation that she had to be part of the daily churn and helping fill the paper every single day. So she just grew generally frustrated by that. So I'd say like the best editors are the ones that trust their reporters and give them the space and the room to breathe, to follow their instincts.
I think we need more than just lip service about these diversity issues. I think journalists who are diverse need to be represented in like all levels of journalism, like as leaders and as middle management and editors and reporters and like copy editors. That's how we're going to get these more representative stories and like change within the industry and how things are done. It's just representation. And I think, it kind of trickles out to the storytelling that we do when our institutions are reflective of the world we live in.
You know, it's one thing to get them in the door, but another thing altogether to support them and make sure that their voices are heard and make sure that they start like rising through the ranks of these organizations. The ceiling isn't at middle management, but that they're taking roles with actual decision-making power.
You know, journalists are people too. We're like error-prone human beings who are doing our best. We don't always feel we can express our opinions on subjects. Some of us have very, very strong feelings on these things. We're not always comfortable or have the ability to have free range of these things. You know, we're striving for objectivity, but we want to make the world a better place, that many of us do. And sometimes we don't know how, or feel like we're limited in ways to do that. You know, I think a lot of people feel like journalists are ill-intentioned. You may not agree with what we write about, feel like we're doing a bad job, but I don't think people are ill-intentioned. So maybe that would be the most hopeful takeaway, that we're just doing our best with the rules and the standards that we think are wisest. But those things are changing or may be changing, and we don't always know if they are the wisest standards.
I feel like you might have gotten some similar answers from people about just feeling like a lot of pressure as a young Black journalist to like do well and succeed, and just feeling a lot of anxiety about your talent and stuff. I hope people would maybe read that and think about what kind of environment are we creating for people, for journalists. Their roles are to tell stories about what's happening. What kind of environment are we creating for them? Is it like a positive one, or is it one where they're being like trampled on? I mean, I hope that maybe someone would question that. And maybe even like people who aren't familiar with journalism or don't think about it in the way that a journalist or someone who studies journalism would think about, oh, wow, the people who are writing these stories are experiencing a lot behind the scenes, and that impacts the work that comes out. And so maybe they can think critically about, if my outlet isn't doing this story, or if they're writing it a certain way, there's like things that are happening that kind of leads to that.
To go back to what we were talking about, is a conversation about norms. It's about really thinking about the way we've constructed this industry, who is being served and who isn't. We are inventing journalism today. What would we do? How would we invent it? That we're not actually handcuffed by any history. We can do whatever we want. And that's not to say you throw everything out for the sake of throwing it out. I don't advocate that at all. But I don't think there's anything that's above critical examination. It's never inappropriate to ask why. And I think our industry is horrified of asking why. Why do we do this way? And what I would say is, at a time when more people have less trust and there are more ways to give more feedback and criticism of the work we do, it's as important as ever that we know why we do what we do and how we do it, and that we articulate that. And unfortunately, I think too many of our newsrooms are failing at that.